how this was, you don't really agree with the retention part of the third grade reading law. You'd like to get rid of it. And I'm wondering, do you see a path toward doing that? Is there support in the legislature for doing that? And if not, like, what kinds of support help do you think you can provide school districts to address kids who might be at risk of being retained?
Yeah. So I think part of the problem that we have in Michigan is for too long, policy decisions have been made without people on the front line being a part of it, even their voices even being heard. It's kind of a unique thing to the legislature because I think everyone attended a public school, so they know what's best in public schools, and don't often listen to literacy coaches or teachers or parents for that matter. The goal is to make sure that our kids are reading by the end of third grade. We're not anywhere near where we should be. We're behind the rest of the country. 49 other states are preparing our kids better than the state of Michigan is when it comes to literacy outcomes. And this punitive philosophy flies in the face of science that shows kids need wraparound supports to be literate by the end of third grade at the expectations that we should all have. So if the goal really is to make sure our kids are reading, that's something I can get behind, right? That's something where I think we can find common ground. But I don't support the bill, the law that they passed that was signed by the last administration. And I am determined to make sure that every child is literate. So my hope is that we're going to be able to find some common ground with the Republican-led legislature. We have a new superintendent coming in at some point in the near future. That process is, ongoing. But this is something I think we have to change. And the goal is right, and that's why in the budget I've written, in supports for tripling the number of literacy coaches, expansion of the Great Start Readiness Program, the kind of wraparound things that help kids in the first place.
So, but just to go back, I mean, what kinds of work do you see happening with the legislature to change the law as it is right now?
Well, we have to get a bill to my desk, and that's not, something that is going to happen easily, but I've had enough conversations with Republicans and Democrats alike to know that there is some common ground here to be had, I believe, and so I remain fairly optimistic that we're going to be able to get it done before the effects of the punitive law are real.
Yeah. So we, in conjunction with Bridge Magazine last year, did a major project on students changing schools. Mm-hmm. And it's extreme in Detroit, where 1 in 3 elementary school students change schools every year. Mm-hmm. It has huge negative impacts on schools, really complicates things both for children and for their schools. At the time, I think we shared the story with your campaign, and you had said, you thought maybe some additional busing, school funding for school busing, transportation could help. Mm-hmm. I didn't see anything like that in your budget proposal. I'm wondering, is that coming back, or is there anything else that you think you can do to help bring some stability to schools? I should also add that our research found that while unstable housing was part of the problem, mm-hmm. a big part of it, a much bigger part of it actually, was state policy that encourages students, if you're not happy at your school, go find something else.
Yeah. When we wrote the state budget, obviously I'm focused on some of the fundamentals that we are lagging the rest of the country, whether it's infrastructure, or it is the cleanliness of our water, or the skills gap that we have, or educational outcomes. Those are the primary ones. We have divided government in Michigan, so there are a lot of spaces where we're not going to be able to find common ground, but I'm hopeful that we can around these fundamentals that are going to improve everyone's lives. Because we've been stealing money out of the school aid fund to backfill the general fund to fill potholes, when we actually rebuild roads the right way by raising the dollars at the pump, we can put those dollars back where they're supposed to go. That's $507 million back into the school aid fund, elevating the foundation allowance for every child in the state, bigger than we've seen as a state in a generation of Michigan kids. We supplement that with greater resources dedicated to kids who are, in the at-risk category, children who require special education, career tech programs. Mm-hmm. And when you do that, you see the foundation allowance have equity built into it. Districts like DPS will take a much bigger step forward and toward equity, and that's something that's important. When you talk about choice and how moving kids has had such an impact on their overall outcomes, we know that when we fund the schools at an equitable level, we're going to have a lot less of that, where people are moving, every year looking for a better opportunity. When DPS is stronger and has better outcomes, their population is going to be more stable, and people are going to want to go to their neighborhood school, and that's why this budget is so important to addressing this. Certainly there are other things that perhaps we can do, but I think the most central part of the solution is funding the education of our kids. And I don't know, Bobby, if you've got the DPS numbers handy, but if you can pull it up, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, we'll definitely get those to you.
You could probably just look it up even right now while we're doing this. I think it's like $424 a student for DPS.
So just by bringing more money to schools, you can raise the quality and
You can get more of the supports in the schools. You can drop the class sizes. You have better outcomes for kids. You can lure you can keep great educators and lure others to come in by offering, a greater level of support for students.
And that transportation piece that you talked about during the campaign, that's not, you don't anticipate?
I think that's something that we perhaps could do in addition at some point, but I think the biggest impact that we can have on the education of Michigan kids statewide, but also in terms of equity, is passing this budget that has this generational investment in our kids, unlike we've seen in 20 years.
So another thing you talked about on the campaign trail was making pre-K universal in Michigan. In your State of the State and in your budget, we did hear a little bit more about ambitious targets that you're laying out for higher education. Can we expect a specific target, a deadline for universal pre-K in Michigan?
I think we need to set expectation. That's part of why I said we're going to close the skills gap and get to 60% of our adults with a post-secondary certificate or degree by 2030. It's aggressive. We're at 44% today. Other states are moving towards 60%. We've got to get serious about this, and so you've got to set a goal. And I think that we absolutely have to have a concrete goal when it comes to universal pre-K. This budget that I've introduced takes a big step toward that through the Great Start Readiness program. I've got some of the numbers in front of me because there's so many numbers on the budget that involve education, which I'm really proud of, but I want to make sure to get them right. So I have an $85 million increase for the Great Start Readiness program, which brings the total funding to $328.9 million. That increases the income eligibility from 250 to 300% of the poverty level, which is an additional 5,100 kids in our state. And we also increased the per child funding from $7,250 to $8,500. That was important as we were looking, how do we expand the population of kids that are able to take part in this program? We don't have enough people that are actually the educators in the program. And that's why the per pupil was really important. And so we did raise the threshold for income, but making sure that we are able to pay the leaders, the educators, was critical to expanding the program. It's one of those things that if we went to 100% today, we wouldn't have the expertise in the classroom to serve the children, and that's why we had to go on both fronts.
Sure. It sounds like you're thinking, though, in the long term for higher education attainment. I heard that 60% by 2030. Do you have a similar specific deadlines in mind for universal pre-K?
I didn't announce any. I think you're asking a really smart question, and I think that I'm going to talk to my policy team about setting those. I think that's a good suggestion.
Thank you.
Do you think how given the sort of assuming your budget goes forward as you spelled it out, this much, it's incremental.
Yeah.
How, at this rate, how long would it take to get from where we are to something that looks like universal?
I think by 4 years. I think by the end of the term.
Okay.
And it's aggressive though, and that's why I want to, we need to see how investing this kind of resources into the per pupil lures, people to go into this profession of education, for the early child. If we can ramp up quickly, I think it's possible.
Cool.
I just wanted to step back real quick. So for the Detroit Public Schools, it's a $424 total
It is
increase.
$424, okay.
It's $176 for foundation increase, $95 for special education, and then $129 for at-risk. Just so you had those numbers.
It's probably the biggest in the state.
So shifting over to charter schools, another theme on the campaign trail is this idea of cracking down on for-profit charter schools. We're still seeing a lot of issues with accountability and oversight, including for some nonprofit schools. I wonder, sort of given the current political landscape, is there anything that you can do to increase regulation of charter schools in the state?
I think that we've got to have better accountability measures, and it's going to take legislation. And so the political landscape is, is a challenge, but it doesn't make it impossible. When you look at the chart on the budget presentation that I'm taking across the state and that I presented to the legislature, and you see where we rank compared to the rest of the country, those aren't Democratic children or Republican children. This is about, all the kids in Michigan. Accountability is important, and it's crucial in the space of for-profit charter schools. And I think that it's crucial in all education spaces. But I think that this is going to be something that we're going to have to find some common ground with the Republican-led legislature. And I'm going to do everything I can to do that.
And where do you think that common ground might be?
Well, I mean, about outcomes for kids. I've talked to legislators, and a lot of the members of the majority party don't have charter schools in their areas. It's not something that they're confronting. It's not something that they see or are familiar with. I do know that a lot of them have had assistance from the industry, and I think that's something that we've got to make sure we do the education. And it's not easy, but I think we can do it, and I'm going to spend some energy on it.
But are there specific policy proposals within charter school oversight that you'd like to see, specific legislation that you'd like to see? If you had a Democratic legislature, or you had more support for that kind of change in the legislature, what specific policy changes would you be calling for?
Well, I think, when it comes to who's standing in the classroom and what their credentials are, I think that with regard to making sure that how the dollars are spent, that they're not going into, rent. I think that, the ensuring the dollars are going into the classroom as opposed to padding the bottom line of these companies. But I mean, obviously for outcomes for our kids, that if you're not producing, I don't believe that, we should be sending state taxpayer dollars into a for-profit company.
Do you think those rules should be different for charters than for public schools? I mean, if you look at Detroit, just for instance, there are a lot of schools that are really struggling, both traditional and charter. So when you talk about additional oversight for schools that are struggling academically, is that specific to charter schools?
Well, no, I think that everyone has to be held to high accountability, right, high standards. But public schools have got a core mission of educating kids, not a bottom line where it's a profit-making endeavor. And that's why they're different. It is, we don't have to create the wheel here. We can learn from what other states have done. And schools that are struggling, when you infuse the resources they need, that's how you change the dynamic. Charter schools that aren't producing, that are profiting off of taxpayer dollars are, we don't have to continue operating those. And I don't think that we should. And that's why we do have to hold everyone accountable. But we have to ensure that every child has a real public school opportunity close to them that they can pursue, that'll give them the skills they need.
Okay, shifting gears over to Detroit Public Schools. You mentioned earlier, you prefaced a comment by saying when DPS is stronger. We know that the superintendent recently said that they expect to be out from under the oversight of the FRC in about 6 months. But they still have a lot of infrastructure challenges in the district. And I'm curious, one, do you think the district is ready to shed the state oversight And two, what is the state's role in helping the district address some of these infrastructure issues, given that they don't really have a whole lot of flexibility when it comes to borrowing money to fix a lot of the building problems that they have?
Right. So certainly the issue in Detroit is acute, but it is not unique as you think about finances for schools across the state and the infrastructure, the ability to bond, the sinking funds that some have that others don't, the revenue that is available in some districts that's not available in districts with higher poverty. So I've talked to Dr. Vitti quite a bit. I think that right now, the best thing that we can do is to get a budget passed that actually invests in the education of kids. And then phase 2 is remedying our issues with regard to infrastructure and helping DPS make the investments in the facilities. One of the lessons that we've learned from DPS that I suspect are applicable to a lot of different districts in Michigan is the old infrastructure that's bringing water into the buildings. I put $60 million in this budget for hydration stations, and that's something that is, you know, I hate that we have to do this, but that's what 40 years of neglect looks like. It's not just our roads, it's not just our bridges, it is the pipes underneath the ground that brings water to our schools and to our homes as well. And so that was something that is really important. They've got a temporary, you know, this is a solution, but we're going to have a much longer term conversation and plan to address the infrastructure problems that plague districts across Michigan. But Detroit is obviously, I think, at the top of the list for where we need to spend our energies.
Do you think that they're ready to sort of shed the oversight of the state right now? They will have passed 3 budgets that are balanced in a row, and I think that gets them out from under the oversight of the FRC. I mean, do you think they're ready for that?
Well, I do. I think that the district's got to be able to function, and for a long time they've been operating not able to make their own decisions and undermined. And I think there's leadership that is ready to take it to the next step. But we're going to, we're paying close attention. We want to make sure that we're delivering results for our kids, all Michigan kids.
So many school districts, urban districts, rural districts are really struggling right now to find enough teachers. Mm-hmm. As you know, when you look at the number of people entering teacher ed programs, it is dropping much faster than the child population, and we're sort of steering toward a little bit of a crisis. I know in your State of the State, you talked a lot about changing the culture of teaching and sort of celebrating teachers and things like that, but are there any programs you could do? I know some states do scholarships and incentives and things like that. Anything you can do that could encourage people to go into teaching?
Mm-hmm. It is kind of the looming crisis that some of us are talking about, but that I don't know that the general public has an appreciation for how few people are going into education nowadays. My mom was a public school teacher. My grandma taught in Waterford. My grandfather was a superintendent of Pontiac schools. And, it was a time when education was a lauded profession, right, where it was respected and supported in a way that it's not currently. The continuous debates here in Lansing and across our country, for that matter, have not valued the work that is done, and it's really squashed the enthusiasm for people who are in the profession or for others to go into it. I've met teachers who leave the profession and go into doing things they never imagined because they can make more money and they feel more appreciated. And I think that's really a sad commentary, but it's real. And so that's why elevating the role of teachers when it comes to policy making is really important, to showing the respect for the profession and the deference for the experience. Mm-hmm. We're going to be making some announcements shortly about how we go, how we put into practice that philosophy, where we are elevating those voices and that they are helping direct policy that's happening here in Lansing. So I'm teasing it, but I can't tell you, well, I hate doing that. But,
You know our next question.
but it's really important, you know, can we do things to help people who do want to go into education and make achieving the degree more affordable? Those are things that I think we're going to have some debate about. But I recognize that this is a crisis that we've got to fix, and it starts with showing respect to the profession, and that's something that is incredibly important to me personally and is reflected in my budget and is going to be reflected in any policy that I sign or choose not to sign
Okay.
as governor.
All right. And then anything within that, is there anything to encourage teachers of color because there's a lot of research that shows, especially for children of color, that really makes a big difference. I mean, is any of that in the announcements that are coming?
You know, I guess I'm going to think with an eye toward that with regard to developing policy to encourage people to pursue a career in education in the first place. That's something that is really the science has shown it. I like to make decisions based on facts and science, and I think kids do have better outcomes when they've got a teacher who comes from their community and at the head of the classroom, and we're going to do something.
So these announcements that are coming are around developing policy that encourage people to go into teaching?
Around respecting and using, empowering people with the expertise to help guide policy that is delivered, that is passed here in Lansing. I know, it's terrible.
It sounds like a teacher advisory board
What's that?
to the
Okay.
legislature. I'm just guessing.
Something like that. Should have put this interview off a week, Rob.
Well, let us know when you're ready to talk about it.
So your budget proposal, we've been talking about the budget proposal kind of in, raising the funding for schools and things like that. But I know there have been a number of reports that were done over the last couple of years, including the School Finance Research Collaborative, that was actually calling for a much more ambitious, complete overhaul of, getting away from the foundation allowance system and just having it really be child-based, and each child gets a different per pupil amount. At least in your first budget, you stopped short of that. Do you anticipate any kind of much more ambitious overhaul of the way we fund schools in Michigan in future budgets?
Well, I think that's a very real possibility. Launch Michigan is doing some research. The business community is now focusing on education because they're seeing what it means to their bottom line and their ability to recruit talent to our state or to build talent within our borders. There is, I think, a lot of work to do in this space, but it starts with getting the school aid fund money back into the schools. And that's why this budget is an enormous step toward addressing this 20-year problem in the making, where we haven't kept up, and not only that, but we've been stealing money from the school aid fund to do other things in the state budget. And so that's why we started with this bold plan that actually puts the money back where it's supposed to go. Now, we get this budget done, I think then the next step is focusing on getting more people to go into education, focusing on innovative ways of identifying how we support kids with different, with different challenges to meeting those expectations. And I think that we can. We don't have to invent the wheel here. There are 49 other states that are doing it better than we when it comes to literacy outcomes. There are a lot who are doing it better than we when it comes to encouraging people to go into the profession. I think the first order of business is getting our fiscal house in order, and that's what I'm trying to do with this budget.
But if you can get this budget through, and obviously you've got, be a lot of work of a stretch over the next couple months. But do you think sort of next year we could see? You said it's a very real possibility, but with this legislature, would it have to require a change in legislative control or?
Well, here's the thing. Divided government is challenging. We have a reminder of that every single day when we look at Washington, D.C., right? It doesn't have to be dysfunctional.
Right.
And this budget is a first major step toward righting some of the things that are wrong in our state. There's a lot of policy work to do in addition to it and beyond it. And whether it takes another year or two with a new legislature, it's at the top of my priority, so we're going to get it done. I can't tell you exactly how quickly, depending on a lot of legislators who I'm still getting to know, but it's my top priority.
But an overhaul like that is something that you would like to see
Absolutely.
sometime in the next 3 3/4 years.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you mentioned, you alluded to the State Board of Ed hiring a new superintendent. They're meeting as we speak to go over the final or the list of applicants. I'm curious to know how much influence you expect to have in who becomes the next state superintendent, and what kind of a person do you think needs to be in that role, given where Michigan is, how schools are struggling right now.
So, it's Michigan's very unique in the way that our system is designed, and the state board makes the decision, but whomever they choose sits on my cabinet. And so I am going to have a number of conversations about who the right person is. I think that the type of person we're looking for is someone who's not afraid to take on the challenges that are inherent to the Department of Ed. Question contracts that have been given, rebuild the infrastructure and the morale in a department that's really important, but is a fraction of the size that it used to be, with a lot more responsibility. To bring people together as well, and to work with the legislature. That skill set is incredibly important, and not everyone has it. And so as I get to know more about the candidates, I'm certainly going to take a very serious interest in who that person is.
Do you have someone that you have either recommended or would like to see in that role?
There are a few people that have put their names in that I think could do the job. I want to understand better what their vision is.
And we just have about a couple minutes left, so maybe a question or two.
UVK Detroit.
Yeah, go for it.
So we've heard a lot of rumblings in Detroit about a universal pre-K system specific to the city. Mayor Duggan has been talking a lot about this. Have you talked to him about that possibility?
Well, he reached out early on and inquired about some federal funding that he was under the impression was available from the last administration, and that was not the case. So it's something that, and that was the sum and substance of that conversation. So I can't shed a whole lot more light on it other than that.
So is the idea then that is like CDBG money, it's called, was actually could not legally have gone to Detroit?
I don't believe that the size was what they had thought that it was, so, as I recall.
And is there anything you can do to help this vision of universal pre-K in Detroit? It would be welcomed by a lot of folks who are thinking about education in this city.
Well, I like I said, because our outcomes are where they are, and the business community is engaging in a way that they haven't before, and I know that the mayor is working on some ideas. We threw some, we sat around a table last fall, and we were kind of spitballing some ideas where we could maybe build some energy, and it wasn't, I obviously wasn't governor at the time, but I think that universal pre-K would change the culture, right, toward education, public education, and add to some of the momentum that's happening in the city, and give people confidence about opportunities for kids in the city. And I think it would be, incredibly helpful.
And is there anything you can do?
Well, like I said, that was the sum and substance of the conversation. So, sure, after your article comes out, that will be re-engaged. But yeah, perhaps there is.
We have time for about one more question. Any last one?
Let's see. Go for it.
I have a question. So there's a lot education-related writing on your budget passing.
Yeah.
Do you have a plan B? Like, what happens if you aren't able to? So,
I don't. That's the thing. I wrote a real plan that solves problems. I'm not going to negotiate with myself and start putting alternative plans out there. There's not a good alternative plan. That's why when the Republicans come back from their vacation, the spring break that they've been on for the last 2 weeks, I anticipate they'll introduce something. I'll look to see what does it mean for every issue on my education budget. What does it mean for closing the skills gap? What does it mean for cleaning up drinking water? What does it mean for fixing the damn roads? There's no superior plan that does the things that my budget does. I'm confident in my budget and feel that any alternative probably won't address all the issues that we're confronting the way that mine does. But if someone has one that does, I'm open to having that conversation. $2.5 billion, though, is the infrastructure bill annually. That's what we need to invest in infrastructure. When we do that, that's what puts us in the position to put general fund money back in the general fund and clean up drinking water. That's what puts us in the position to put the school aid fund dollars back and to do all of these amazing pieces on the education front that are built into this budget. And short of that, this doesn't happen. And that's why, I have confidence in my budget, and that's why, even though it wasn't easy to introduce and to ask people to make this kind of investment, I'm 100% stand by it because it is the best way to solve these problems.
All right, thank you, Governor.
Here's kind of our notes on the what's all in the budget, just so you've got it, kind of a summary of.
This is really helpful.
You can
Thank
take that.
Yeah.
And your charter school
published it.
questions were good. You asked some, and I didn't have I hadn't anticipated we'd talk so much about how we can have more accountability. So maybe if we refresh a little bit and send you something, that would be helpful.
On charter school, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I know on the campaign you
We had a number of things.
so you kept saying when you got the charter school question on the campaign,
Yeah.
your answer was often about for-profit. But over the last couple of months, we've had story after story after story about nonprofit charters that were created by very well-intentioned people, and for various reasons, it just didn't work.
Right.
Couldn't get the enrollment, the
Yeah.
finances, they weren't the right people, the boards just weren't up to the challenge.
Right.
And so it's sort of the focus on for-profit, like, it makes sense, but it's also like one part of a large problem.
Sure, right. Well, and we have to have accountability amongst everyone, right? Kids who go to for-profit charters shouldn't have different expectations than kids at nonprofit charters or public schools,
Right.
for that matter.
Yeah.
Yeah. I hadn't refreshed on charters though in a while. That's why I was like, okay, let me go back and think. I'm so budget oriented. I'm like, budget. I dream about the budget.
All right. Thank you
Sad,
so
right?
much.